started. Welcome everyone to Introduction to Organic Certification and Record Keeping. It looks like we don't have too big of a group here today, so if anyone wants to move up, feel free. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk and we'll go from there. I'll start with introductions of myself. My name is Jessica Terry. I'm a Senior Certification Specialist with NOFA-NY Certified Organic LLC. I've been with NOFA for just about 10 years now, and I've had a variety of different roles with the organization, answering phones, reviewing files, reviewing inputs, and yeah, now I'm here giving presentations. So thank you all for being here. This is a complex process that we're going to try to go through pretty quickly today, so we're going to move through a lot of material. One of the things I think that helps this presentation be more interactive and more useful for you all is the questions, so please don't hesitate. If we're covering information that you wonder how does it apply to your farm or your situation, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or ask the questions. I think I'd like to start to sort of poll you guys to find out who we have in the audience and what you're here for today. So I'd say anyone interested in certifying vegetables, herbs, berries, flowers, would you raise your hands? Okay, good, that's what I figured, it's usually a good chunk. How about field crops, hay? Okay, livestock? Dairy, poultry, dairy, yeah. How about value added or on-farm processing? No, okay, that's good. We have a livestock workshop tomorrow for those of you doing livestock that gets a little more in depth. We're going to touch on it here today, but it's not the big focus today. Anyone here from other agencies or organizations that aren't here because they're a farmer but just to gain information? Okay. Anyone here who is already certified? That has happened. We get people that come in like to get a refresher course. I mean, there is a lot of details sometimes with it, so. Some of you may be familiar with the organization, some of you may not be. Basically, we're split into two branches. There's NOFA-NY Inc., who is the education and outreach branch. They do advocacy, they do all the publications that you might get in the mail, they organize this conference. They have field days and workshops that are really great. And the Farmer Technical Assistance Hotline, if you have questions, you can call that hotline and there's farmers that will help you figure out maybe what you need to do. The certification branch, that's who I'm here representing today. We are accredited by the USDA to perform organic certification services. We verify compliance with the regulations and help answer any questions that have to do with can you or can you not do a certain thing when you're certified organic. So the process, it's an annual process. The first year you apply, it's a little more intensive because you're establishing that paperwork for the first time and that record keeping and kind of getting familiar with that process. And then every year after you sort of repeat the process, it just becomes a little simpler where you're just updating information that is already on file, and we take you through that pretty easily. So you submit your application with your certification fee. You can do that any time in the year. It's a good idea to do that early on if you're looking for early season crops to be certified. We will review your application, let you know if anything's missing, if any more information is needed. You'll get a letter to prepare you for the inspection visit and any other items to have ready. The inspector will contact you to schedule your site visit. You will have that, and then we receive a report back in the office, which we will review, and then we do a final determination on your certification, whether it's approved or pending, or if there's more information needed, and then we issue the certificate. That whole process, depending on the year, can vary in time frame. The very first year you apply, you're priority, so it's usually 2 to 3 months probably, that turnaround time. In successive years, it may be a lot longer if you're not adding any new production or any new fields or anything like that. It could be 6 months. It all depends on the inspectors and what the plans are for the year. So that's sort of how the process goes. So I talked a little bit about that. Yes?
Could you, if you're going to talk about it later, just say so.
Okay.
Could you talk about what is the right time if you're thinking about something new? Can you certify before you're actually to market, or do you need to have a product in the marketplace before you then certify?
Right, that's an excellent question. Generally, you should be thinking ahead, and you can be certified before you have a final product. For instance, if you're growing a crop or something, the inspector would like to see some action in the field, seeds planted, things growing, but we're not expecting that finished product to be there yet. For livestock, the same thing. Especially for livestock, it's better to start early because you have to think about whether you're dealing with the last third of gestation organic management for meat, or if you're going to do a dairy transition, or what the plan is as far as that goes. So it's a good idea to contact the office early, figure out what you need to do and what the time frame looks like, early on, so that you don't get into a scenario where you do have product that's ready to go but no certificate yet. That's a good question. Thank you. So the time frames, we talked about this a little bit. Basically, if you apply before May, which is ideal for a first-year applicant looking for their growing season crops to be certified, we would inspect in May or June, and then you would get your certificate June or July. And then it kind of filters out from there. After August, there's no guarantee, but we certainly do receive a lot of applications that late in the year, and we process them and get it through. It's just you may miss the cost share reimbursement, which we're going to talk about, and you'll be turning right around and renewing pretty soon. So there are considerations depending on what time of the year you want to apply. For crops, obviously you're going to want to apply early so that we can inspect and get that before the growing season. Livestock, it's not as critical. Another thing which I mentioned is those early crops, asparagus, strawberries, first cutting hay. If you want that certified, definitely get your application in pretty early. And of course, you can't market anything as organic until you have that certificate in your hand. Just because you've been inspected, that doesn't mean you're good to go and start selling as organic, because we've had that happen, and you do have to wait for that process to finish. So the cost share program is really great. This has been going on for many, many years, and it really helps a lot, especially the smaller scale farmers, for certification to be more affordable. It's a federal program that's administered by New York State Ag and Markets or other state ag departments. It covers 75% of your certification fee, up to $750 per scope. So if you're doing crops and livestock and you have a larger operation, you could earn that $750 back for both of those aspects. So yeah, it's a really great program that helps a lot. So who can use the term organic? Basically, if you're going to use the term organic, you have to be certified. You probably have seen a lot of people throw the word organic around. They don't know. It's just a word. It's in the dictionary. Why not? Why can't I say organic? But unfortunately, the USDA does own the word and has a lot of really strict regulations and requirements as far as using it. You have to be certified if you're going to call something organic, certified or 100% organic, made with organic. There is an exemption for that under 5,000, which some of you may have heard of or may not. Sometimes in the farmer's market, this comes into play with people using the word organic. If you make less than $5,000 annual gross organic sales, you can use the word organic without being certified. But you do need to follow all the regulations and be willing to be audited. So that is something you may hear about. But for most people, you need that certification. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you're choosing to be certified. This is a voluntary program, and you are agreeing to those rules and regulations when you become certified. We get a lot of people that like to complain about the rules and that they don't make any sense, it's not common sense, and it doesn't really work for them, and why is it like this? And we understand, we get that, but at the same time, the rules are the rules, and if you're going to be certified, you have to follow them no matter what you really feel about them. Okay, so the Organic System Plan, or the OSP, this is something you'll hear us talk about a lot. It's sort of that main piece of your application. When you get the application, there's going to be a booklet that you're going to fill out that covers most of the main aspects of your management and your plan for the farm. That's going to do field history, natural resource management, pest, weed, and disease control, fertility, your harvesting, post-harvest handling, labeling, storage, all of that stuff. So all of those things together is kind of what makes up that OSP booklet. In addition to that, it includes all of the supplemental forms that you may keep for your record keeping. So if you have applied amendment spray records or harvest records or seed documents, all of that stuff together encompasses the Greater Organic System Plan, or OSP. We will review that, and that's where we look for compliance to the regulations, that you're incorporating biological and mechanical practices to foster sustainability, promoting healthy soil, and natural resource and animal welfare. So those are just a few of the things that we'll look for in that organic system plan. Okay, so basic land requirements. This is sort of that starting point. You want to be certified. You don't know, can I be certified? Does my land qualify? So the starting point is it has to be free of prohibited materials for the last 3 years. So that includes things such as treated and GMO seed, obviously your conventional fertilizers, your conventional herbicides, and things like that. Any of those would disqualify that land until you've reached that 3-year transition mark. If you are looking to certify a new piece of land, we have a form for that, and you would have the previous owner or manager complete that and sign it documenting what's been done with the land, and then we would review that. Otherwise, you're just filling out the new field history, giving us what's been applied, the dates they've been applied, and we will review that along with the seed documentation to see if your land qualifies, and that's where we make that decision. Once you're certified, there are things that we'll be looking for that you're doing with your land, such as crop rotation, building, soil structure, and basically just, using a good fertility system and following the regulations as far as that goes. Treated lumber is a topic that comes up a lot. It's not, new installations are not allowed. Older treated wood that's pre-existing on your farm does get grandfathered in. So, if you have fence posts or something along those lines that they likely would not be an issue for you to achieve certification. It would just be any new installations once you're certified. And that doesn't stand for direct contact with crops though. So if it's a treated trellis that's already there, that might be an issue. So just something to keep in mind. Yes?
How do these apply to, for instance, a house that's on a farm? Can you put in a treated porch?
Yeah, it does not apply to that. This is basically lumber that comes in contact with organic production areas. So buildings often are not a concern. Sometimes with the barns, obviously there's going to be treated lumber, and generally that's not a concern. It's any areas where the livestock would have direct contact with it, feed troughs. Sometimes there's beams that they may chew that we would ask that you would get that cover them with plastic or untreated wood. But yeah, generally buildings are fine. That's not an issue.
And the same question on seeds or something, if there's a flower bed in front of the house, if there was, we don't know if the seed was certified or not, is that an issue?
Yeah, so if you're looking to certify that flower bed, we would.
That flower bed.
I see.
That's what I'm saying, something that's just, decorative in front of a house.
That's not a concern.
Okay.
Yeah, we look at that as outside organic production. So we don't, within a farm, you might say your whole farm is certified, but we understand there's actual production areas, and that's what we really focus on, and then there's the outside areas, which we don't, unless there's some concern of leaching or some kind of contamination that could come from that area. Yes?
I came a little late, I'm sorry if you answered this already, but does this mean you don't really contact NOFA until 3 years?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. So there's options with that. Often someone will wait until the year their land is eligible and then maybe call us up in January or February and say they want to apply that year. That's really common, but we do offer a land transition program where you can apply at any point in that 3-year time period, and we sort of walk you through that process. We can give you a letter that states you're formally in organic transition. Sometimes you can use that for grants like NRCS or things like that, or other uses. And basically it works the same way. That's not really any difference in the process, other than you don't really get a certificate at the end and the fees are less.
Right, I was just thinking, is there a way to see if you're on track during the 3 years, so at the 3rd year you're...
Right, so that's a really good benefit to doing the land transition, but you're always welcome to call the office. We get these questions all the time. Ask Kristen. People, just random people, hey, we're thinking about maybe being certified, and can you tell us, can we use this, or what's the deal with that? And we're happy to help answer those questions for sure. Yes?
It sounds, so I have a purchased land that has been in hay for the last, probably 15, 20 years. And so would I need to get this affirmation from the person who's putting hay? Would that be sufficient? sufficient?
That's another excellent question. Often, who is the previous owner, who is the manager? Is it the landowner? Is it the person who's farming the fields? We would probably accept either, whoever can rightfully speak on what's happened on that land in those 3-year time period. So if it's the farmer cutting the hay, we would accept that, or if it's the landowner who is knowledgeable of activity on the land, we would accept that as well. Yes? Yes?
Just going back to treated posts.
Yeah.
What's the threshold for acceptability? We have a block of, call it 500 apple trees that have a trellis system installed. It was installed maybe 15 years ago.
Right,
Is
so
there an acceptability threshold for leaving that rather than removing it?
yeah, often we'll look at that 3-year transition as sort of like a guideline, and anything that may have happened previous to that 3 years. Treated wood is a little weird right now because there's a proposed guidance that's out there, but it's not finalized, and different certifiers have different viewpoints on that, so it's a little up in the air. But at this point, NOFA would probably say that that was grandfathered in and wouldn't be an issue. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Maps. So we do ask for maps. You know, we're talking about land. We want to be able to visualize that land in the office. And then the inspectors will use those when they're on site to go around and look at what the fields you're certifying and what your farm looks like. So it's an important piece. We like to just give an example to kind of show you what we're looking for. It can be hand-drawn, it can be satellite, it can be computer, it really can be anything. We do ask for certain details to be included on the map: the directional orientation, IDs, acreage, natural features, buffer zones, things along those lines. Often we may just get a square on a piece of paper with a letter on it. That, you know, we really try to work with everyone to be practical and not make this really cumbersome for you. But I mean, at the same time, we do want to be able to get that picture of your operation, which helps the reviewers who may never go to your farm to understand what you're doing, and then the inspectors to just make sense of it when they're there. So, okay, allowed and prohibited substances. So this is a big one. This is something many people wonder about or don't know if their land's going to qualify, or what can I use once I'm certified organic. What do I do? So in theory, it's simple. There is something called the National List, which is a part of the regulations, which explains what you can use, you know, in organic production for crops or livestock or processing. And how it works is it's broken out into 2 sections. You have your synthetics that are allowed, and then your non-synthetic or naturals that are prohibited. So basically how that works is any synthetic that's not on that list is prohibited. And then any natural that's not on the list is allowed. So that's sort of how you look at that. It is confusing sometimes to look at it, and that's why, you know, we're here to help you through that. We have an internal database that we maintain, and we have a published list for livestock products right now that you can look at to reference, can I use this material or can I not? There's other resources too, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Keep in mind the big 3, which are prohibited. That's GMOs, ionizing radiation, and sewage sludge. So obviously those 3 items, if they are in your product, that's a big no-no. It's not going to work. It's not going to fly. Okay, so more about inputs and their intended use. One thing to keep in mind is that organic certification is not just switching out conventional for organic approved inputs. And this does happen. We get farmers and they've got a product list that's like 100 different products on there that they're going to just slap on their soil. And, you know, in theory, those items are allowed, but that is supposed to come after you've tried other techniques and they have failed. So really, we're looking for you to establish preventative and management practices, such as crop rotation, early on. That's going to help you manage those issues. And then you would have to rely less on those inputs. But obviously, we also understand that sometimes you're just going to need that. And there's a lot of options for when that comes. Must be approved prior to use. That's probably the biggest thing to remember. We get lots of people who go and buy something at Agway, and they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so said that's fine. The salesman said the organic farmer down the road used that, so I'm going to go put it on my land. And, you know, that is not a good idea. We've very often had to issue non-compliances and even pull land from certification because of prohibited applications, because there's really no leeway there. If you apply something to your land that's prohibited, it's out for 3 years. There's nothing we can do about that. So it's really important to keep in mind. And even with the natural things as simple as peat moss or limestone, you know, there's more to it than just saying, oh, it's a natural, it's not prohibited, so it must be I can use it. You know, we really contact each and every manufacturer to make sure there's no additives. Like for peat moss, there's not any wetting agents that might not be on the label. Like gypsum is a good one. There's a lot of gypsum out there that's made out of wallboard, you know, that's not pure mined. So there is things to keep in mind, even with the so-called naturals. So, you know, check on those as well. We do offer a product review program if there's a product that you want to use that we don't have in our database or isn't on the accepted materials lists. We are happy to review that for compliance to the regulations, so that's a service we offer. Currently, we are accepting OMRI, which is the Organic Material Reviews Institute. It's a really great organization. They have a really easy website to use, and they publish lists every year. They have a brand materials list of products that are allowed for use, and that's pretty much accepted across the board with all different certifiers. So you go to OMRI. It's always a good idea to check with us first, because OMRI does drop products off their list, add products, change things. So if you have that hard copy, you know, it's not a bad idea to check the website or to call the office to double check that's okay. And there's also restrictions often on the way a product can be used. Just because it's allowed for land doesn't mean you can use it on livestock, or just because you can use it for fertility doesn't mean you can use it for pest control and things like that. So there are a lot of considerations with the different inputs and things that you may want to use. So OMRI is really great. We also accept CDFA, which is California Department Farming and Agriculture, and WSDA, which is Washington State Department of Ag. They both have recognized published lists, recognized by the NOP, and we accept products listed on those organizations as well. Any questions on inputs, fertilizers? Yes?
With mushroom production, we use hardwood sawdust pellets, and it's not necessarily organic certified. How do the reviewers confirm whether or not the sawdust is pelletized to make is that specifically to that brand where they've done the review, and it has to be on that specific sawdust, or that specific label has to have been under review and confirmed to be legitimate? And if so, it doesn't say it on the label, so how would we be able to know? It's just as like hardwood sawdust pellets. You know?
Right. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and that applies to so many things. The label tells you nothing. You have no information, and what do you do? Yeah, I mean, we would review that, especially when we hear the word pellet. That sets off a little alarm bell. You know, what binders are they using, or what are they doing to pelletize that? In general, we don't see a lot of issues with most sawdust, but even there, we do look for that to be untreated wood. But in that instance, we would figure out who that manufacturer is, contact them, and find out what they're using to pellet, and do a review of the ingredients that were used. And yeah, I mean, what do you do when you just don't know? That's the tricky part. You know, and OMRI's great that it gives you options, but it's certainly not all-encompassing. And, you know, sometimes you're just going to have to take a photo of it, send it to us, say, hey, can you look into this? Fingers crossed. Yeah, exactly. There are certain materials that we've seen, you know, through the years that we know for the most part are fine, and we don't, you know, usually we look at the packaging to see if does it say 100% wood, you know, like 100% this, or, you know, any additive statements, and sometimes that's enough, but most of the time we do have to contact that specific manufacturer, yes. Yeah?
What if it's not a manufacturer? What if it's my neighbor's sawmill?
That's fine. We might ask you to get a statement from your neighbor that says, because we get that a lot with our Amish folks that we certify, there's a lot of that sort of thing, and then you might have them write up a statement that says sawdust is untreated wood with no additives, and we put that in your file, and that's fine. Yep, absolutely. Yes?
As far as changes in OMRI lists,
Mm-hmm.
how do you keep abreast of that? As far as changes in-
Yes, nice, good question. So OMRI's really great that we subscribe to them. They send us the drop list. So whenever they publish a list of materials that are being dropped or possibly prohibited. We receive that in the office. We will contact any of our producers who are using those materials to let them know of that status change, because we do keep lists of what everyone is using. If it's just a drop material, generally we allow a use up, because we understand that nothing probably changed in the usability of that made it okay. It's just maybe the manufacturer didn't renew their application or whatever the case may be. And then you can have till the end of that season to use it up. And then if someone really wants to, they could pay the review fees, and then we internally would perform a review outside of OMRI. So that's an option too. Okay. Okay, seeds. So this is another area that, of course, most people have to think about and plan for when they're going to be certified. A lot of people think you have to be organic seed, and there's no way around that. Generally, the regulations say organic seed is required, but only if it's commercially available. There is a clause in there that if you can't find what you're looking for in organic, after you've searched, done a commercial availability search, usually to us that means that you've checked at least 3 viable seed sources that actually sell organic seed, and you can't find what you're looking for because of quality, quantity, or form, such as variety, then it's okay to get conventional seed, as long as you get documentation that it's untreated and non-GMO. So that's kind of the whole deal with seeds. You get organic if you can find them. If you can't find them, you can get your conventional, but you got to get that documentation to back it up. Generally, the safe seed, there's a lot of vegetable seed companies out there that go by the safe seed pledge. We do accept that as proof of non-GMO. The untreated would be the thing to pay attention to there. And again, we only ask for non-GMO for varieties that actually are genetically modified. We look at the APHIS list and pay attention to what is out there currently that is available as a genetically modified option, and then if it's not, then that's not really something you have to worry about. So that's seed. Transplants, by that we mean annual seedlings. They have to be certified organic. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that one. You can't go buy a conventional transplant because you can't find what you want. Like the tomato grower down the road doesn't have organic. Can't use those transplants. They have to be certified organic. Pelleted seed, we have to review the ingredients in that, just like we were talking about with the sawdust pellets. There are allowed ones and there are approved ones. So that's something to pay attention to, as well as if your seed has any pelleting on it in addition to any treatments it might have. Perennials work a little bit different. We do ask for commercial availability, but there's not a lot of organic availability for a lot of perennial stock out there. We understand that. I think it is growing. There is becoming more, but it's still an area where it is hard to find what you're looking for in organic. So with perennials, they have to be managed organically for a year if you're going to turn around and sell that plant as planting stock, as organic planting stock. You have to manage it organically for 1 year. Otherwise, it works the same with seed. Commercial availability, do that search for 3 sources, and then make sure that it's untreated. And inoculants can be allowed as long as they're non-GMO and approved. Yes?
So this would apply to bales of stock for treating. So if it's not organic, then you have to, of course it's not going to grow, really be producing for a couple years anyway. But, so I guess that adds on.
Right, exactly. If you don't find your organic, you just get your conventional, as long as it's not treated post-harvest or when they're preparing it for shipment. You absolutely can use that. Yep. Okay, so we'll move on to manure and compost. This is another common area that we deal with. A lot of people think they can only use certified organic manure on their organic farm. It's a nice thought, but first of all, there is no such thing as certified organic manure. You also might hear talking about inputs, as we were previously, about certified organic, or you'll see on the bag that the manufacturer likes to write the word organic on stuff. There is no oversight of soil inputs by the USDA of that word organic, so just keep that in mind when you're looking at materials to use. Just because it has the word organic on it does not mean it's certified. Most likely it's not. It generally can't be, and don't just take it at face value. So organic matter is kind of internally how we talk about plant matter, your kitchen scraps, vegetable coals, different organic matter you might pull off your fields. That's all allowed across the board. It can be organic, but it doesn't have to be organic. Plant matter is just allowed. So you can get that from your neighbor who's not certified and use it on your organic farm. We might ask you, you know, what's in it, what does it consist of, and make sure it doesn't contain any prohibiteds, but generally that is fine. Manure. So this includes all forms of manure that's not composted per the regulations, which we're going to talk about next. So that includes piled, aged, raw. I mean, we hear all kinds of different descriptors when someone's talking about their old pile that's been sitting out back for 10 years and can't they just use it on their vegetables? Well, the answer is no, unless you prove that it's composted per these regulations. It has to be applied as manure. And what does that mean? So basically that means if you're growing human consumption crops, there is a guideline as far as when you can apply that manure versus when you can harvest those crops. So it's 90 days before harvest if the edible portion does not touch the soil, and it's 120 days from manure application to harvest if the edible portion can have contact with soil particles. So generally speaking, it's 120 for most vegetables. 90 would be things like fruit trees, sweet corn. That's really about it. I mean, we will entertain plans. If you have a really great trellising system for your tomatoes and you've got plastic down and you really think you're going to meet that 90, we'll look at it. But for the most part, if there's a chance even the lower, lying fruit of the plant can touch the soil, we're looking for that 120 days to go by before you're harvesting. So that is something to think about. A lot of our vegetable operations will apply in the fall, apply their manure in the fall, real early spring, or only to their later season crops. So compost. Obviously, you absolutely can do your own composting and you can purchase compost. We have a lot of approved composts in our database that, if you're looking for that, we can help you out. If you're making your own compost, the regulations state specific requirements, which are stated here on this slide. So the initial carbon to nitrogen ratio has to be between 25 to 1 and 40 to 1. There's very specific temperatures that need to be reached and amount of times that your pile has to be turned if you're doing a windrow system, and different requirements if you're doing static aerated. So we have a questionnaire that we ask you to fill out if you're looking to get your compost approved for unrestricted use. We will review that, let you know what we think and if that's going to work, and if it does, then you're approved to use that unrestricted on your human crops. If you're just doing feed crops, field crops, things that aren't for human consumption, there's no restriction on the manure. It can be used across the board. If you're sourcing from a conventional dairy farm, we may ask about what also might be in that manure if it came from the slurry or from something that there may be adding pit additives or odor controls to it, then that could be an issue. So it is a good idea to pay attention to where you're getting your manure from if you're just going to be applying it to your fields. Yes?
On organic matter, how does that apply to animal products, bone meal, blood, those types of things?
For use on fields, like as a soil amendment? Yeah, so we don't really, mostly those things are fine. We would review that like anything else. We would just look for that purity statement that's just ground up bones or it's just dried blood or whatever the case may be. But generally, I don't think I have once seen an issue with those sort of materials. So yeah, those are fine. Yeah.
Were you asking about
I don't think he's asking for feed. Is that what you're wondering?
I thought you were wondering if you process birds on your farm and you put all of the waste into bone them and put all their innards and stuff in the compost piles. I thought that's what you were asking.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't think.
It doesn't follow the 90-120 day. It's not treated like manure, right?
I don't think so. If you're composting it fully per the regulations, meeting those temperatures, that's supposed to eliminate any pathogenic concerns.
So it does have to be composted.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm not sure, like if you're just taking your, like she's saying, the parts from after processing and you want to just go and apply them to the fields. That's not what you're asking. Okay, good. See, tough questions. We get those. And then we look at each other and we're like, let me refer to our handbook and get back to you.
With the compost, is there like a time frame? Like do you have to be monitoring it to maintain this temperature like on a constant basis, or is it like if you kind of age it for multiple years, is there a point where it's like, okay, this is okay?
Yeah, you kind of only have to do it once per batch, like to prove that you've met this, and then once it's been met, that batch is considered allowed. And then if you start a new batch, we would want to see that. So usually there's a compost log that you would maintain that says when you turned it, you know, what dates you turned it on, and then what the temperatures are. And once you've demonstrated, you know, that 15 days between 131 and 170, then that pile is good. I mean, that pile could probably sit there for a few years, but we would still consider that having met that requirement. Yeah. Any other questions on manure, compost, inputs? Okay. So another really, really common area that we deal with is buffer zones or adjoining crop use. And we get a lot of questions about this in the office, about what your neighbor's doing, or you're right next to an orchard, or, you know, runoff or things like that, and what do you do? So basically it's up to you to establish a buffer zone that's adequate to prevent contamination from that. And what does that mean? We are not supposed to give you specific numbers because we can't tell you what to do. That's one of the things as a certification agency. We can answer your questions if something's allowed or not allowed, but we can't really tell you what to do or how to fix it. There are some numbers that's in our guidance manual that you can use as a starting point for when you start to think about what kind of a buffer zone you may need on your property. I can tell you that the guidance manual says that 50 feet may be a good starting point to consider, and then see from there whether it may need to be more or less depending on what's going on next to there. And that's just for kind of basic, you know, spray drift, not, you know, boom spray or aerial spraying or things like that, which is going to drift a lot farther. So we do talk about that as well. You know, there's obviously more concern when you're dealing with that. But basically we're looking that the buffer zone is big enough to prevent the spray drift or any other sorts of contamination. Things to consider are wind direction, runoff, different things like that when you're establishing that, what type of buffer it is. A 15-foot hedgerow may be a perfectly adequate buffer, and while a 50-foot open area may not be. So there's a lot of variables to consider when you're looking at buffers. If your buffer is not big enough and that's found out at inspection, it's not going to make it so you can't be certified. It's not going to, you know, disqualify your field. Basically what happens is, you know, we're going to work with you in figuring out how to get that adequate buffer in place, and the inspectors play a big role in that. They're going to come out, they're going to look at your situation, determine whether they think there's a concern or not. If there is a concern, then we may go back to you and ask you what's your plan to address this. We understand that this is a back and forth process, and it's not something that you may know right from the get-go whether it's going to work or not. So that is something good to keep in mind. GMO pollen drift is something that we think about. Generally, this only comes into play with corn. With soybeans, the understanding is the pollen doesn't go as far, it self-pollinates, so your typical 50-foot buffer zone may be adequate to prevent any issue there. We're not seeing a whole lot with alfalfa yet, though that's something that could be a concern and is something to keep in mind if you're growing alfalfa, and if your neighbor has it, are they using GMO, because that could become a really big concern. But basically corn is the thing that we deal with a lot. There's a lot of corn in New York State, a lot of people are growing it, and a lot of people are doing GMO corn. If you're growing organic corn, so you want to keep in mind what your neighbor is doing. We usually ask for you to document planting dates for when you're planting your corn and when your neighbor's planting, what type of corn, what day length those seeds are, but ultimately all of that is to see when the tasseling occurs. We're looking for there to be at least a 2-week difference in tassel dates between the organic corn and the neighboring corn to prevent cross-pollination. So, we will have you document those dates if you run into that scenario. Ideally, you're not going to, because you won't grow corn if your GMO neighbor's growing it. I mean, that's sort of the preferred method, but sometimes we realize that's not possible for whatever reason or practical, and the situation occurs. We do have a form that helps to document that information. We may come out and do a spot inspection if we think there could be a concern, but generally that's what we're looking for, that 2-week tasseling difference in time frame there. If it happens within that 2-week period, what then? Generally speaking, we will ask you for a plan to prevent that in the future. We may do GMO testing, depends on the severity of the contamination, whether that crop would still qualify as organic or not. So there's a process for that when that situation comes up. Any questions about buffers, or anyone have a scenario that they were wondering about or anything? Yes?
For urban farms where generally there is some spraying, overhead spraying in general for mosquitoes, especially now with Zika, how does that apply?
Right, yeah, so that is a concern. We usually recommend that you send notification letters out to your utility companies as part of that certification process, the highway department, the health department, because that spraying does happen. If it occurred, would it disqualify your crops? It might. Yeah, because even accidental or incidental, I mean, it's still a prohibited application, whether you had any control over it or not. And that happens. We get people where their neighbor came in, they contracted with some spray company, and oops, they sprayed the organic field. And we feel really bad, but ultimately, we really can't do anything about that. That field will then have to transition most of the time.
Have you had that instance where there have been farms that sent these notification letters out and it actually did prevent the spraying?
Yeah, I think the utility companies and the highway departments, they're starting to see more of these. They're starting to understand a little bit more. And yeah, we have seen successes with that. A lot of times the farmers will say, I'm going to mow this roadway, so you don't have to come and spray herbicides along this road front that borders my organic field, and then that's fine. So yeah, we have seen both sides of it, but I think there is a majority of them that are willing to work with organic farmers, so that's really good. Yeah.
What's the buffer zone for apiary products, bees? And
Well, that is an interesting question. Currently, NOFA does not certify bees or honey or apiary. There are other certifiers out there who are certifying bees, but there is no specific regulation right now for that, and it doesn't really fit under the livestock regulations as they're written. I mean, last litter gestation of a bee, it's a little strange, outdoor access, so we don't feel comfortable being able to certify bees, but we have heard it's like a 7-mile radius, 5-mile radius. Right, I mean, it feels almost impossible unless you're out in the Adirondack somewhere.
Kind of around the east, it's a little easier on the west coast where they have more land out there.
Yeah. So you can go buy organic honey in the store for sure. I mean, but, like I said, other certifiers are just basically building their own standard for that without there being anything in the USDA regulations to really back it up. So it makes it a little bit tricky, and we've sort of stayed away from that right now. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Okay, so livestock, we're gonna touch on livestock a little bit. We're not gonna get too in-depth on this today. We do offer a workshop tomorrow at 1 p.m. in Broadway 3. If you're interested, you can come to that, and we get a lot more in-depth on the livestock side of things. But we'll touch on it a little bit, and certainly if you have any questions, we can talk about livestock today. Basically, living conditions and healthcare practices is an important area to consider. Must allow for natural behavior of the species, so direct access to sunlight, year-round outdoor access, and that includes for poultry. We're looking for preventative animal husbandry, proactive management practices. Animal welfare is something also that we look at a little bit. You can't withhold treatment to preserve the organic status of an animal. If you have to give it antibiotics to save its life, then you have to do that, and then it may have to be removed from the herd or whatever the case may be there. If you treat an animal, they may be able to become breeding stock on your farm, which means they can produce offspring that's eligible, but they will never be certified organic once they've been treated with the prohibited material. There's a lot that kind of comes into play with that sort of thing, and we work with the farm, especially with dairies. You know, we understand there's a lot of scenarios with healthcare that come up, and we have a lot of good resources and materials in the office for helping to deal with that. So feed and pasturing is another area, of course. When you're doing livestock, they can only receive 100% certified organic feed. There's no exceptions to that. That includes bedding. If it's agricultural, if it's non-agricultural bedding such as sawdust, obviously you're not going to be able to get it organic anyway. So you have to manage your livestock continually on certified organic land. For ruminants, at least for cows, we recommend the 0.75 acres per 1,000-pound animal, which is just a guideline when you're trying to think about, is your current situation going to work to be certified organic? Do you have enough pasture? Are you going to be able to meet the dry matter intake requirements with the amount of pasture that you have? So that's something to think about. The pasture rule, which was established a few years ago, set some really specific requirements as far as dry matter intake from pasture. So right now you have to get a minimum of 30% dry matter intake on average throughout the grazing season, which is fairly simple to do for most of the people here in New York. That's not too hard, and that is an average of at least 30%. And your animals have to be on pasture throughout the grazing season at least 120 days. Which again, we're usually seeing closer to 150 here for many operations. So these rules really aren't too difficult. We supply the chart and we will do the calculations, and we have forms to try to make it as easy as possible to meet those requirements. And we have all those resources that we can offer. Any questions on livestock, feed? Okay, so the healthcare practices, we talked about that a little bit. This gives you a little bit more information as far as what's prohibited and what's allowed. So prohibited: antibiotics, hormones, most synthetic medications, and animal byproducts. Those are probably the biggest ones that you'll run into in conventional that are not allowed in organic. Tail docking is prohibited in cattle and pigs. It's restricted in sheep. Milk replacer, synthetic milk replacer is prohibited. We used to say milk replacer is prohibited, but there is now certified organic milk replacer on the market. So we are starting to see that a little bit. So, you know, it could be an option if you really need that. Most of the time, young are getting milk from their dams or certified organic milk from the bulk tank or whatever the case may be. Synthetic amino acids are prohibited. Parasiticides are prohibited. In slaughter stock, they're regulated. If you have a dairy and you need to use them for your animals, there's a milk withhold time that has to be looked at and followed, and then any milk in that time period has to be disposed of. And dehorning paste is prohibited. We'll look at your process for dehorning to determine whether it meets, you know, the regulations. So there are something, most of the time, I guess, lidocaine or something along those lines is what's used for dehorning. What's allowed? Vaccines are allowed? Yes, question?
Sorry. The animal byproduct, how does that work for omnivore species? Chickens eating bugs, pigs eating table scraps?
Right. So whatever the poultry may get from the certified land is fine. You know, we're talking about like byproducts that are in the feed that you're buying or possibly in your mineral or supplements that are there. Yes, we're not talking about what they may naturally. The table scraps, again, as long as they're certified organic, you can feed those to your pigs, yeah. You do have to be organic, though. You can't just be, you know, yeah. It's a good question. Okay, so allowed, the vaccines are allowed across the board right now. There is starting to be more thought about looking for them to be non-GMO, so that's something to pay attention to if you're going to vaccinate. Oxytocin is allowed only for post-calving emergencies, and some milk companies prohibit it. So if you're a dairy looking to get into that, check with your milk company before you use it. Mineral and salt formulations are allowed. We review those. We'll look at every ingredient to make sure they're allowed according to the regulations. Things in your mineral or salt that would be an issue: mineral oil, artificial colors, and yellow prussiate of soda. So any anti-caking agents like that in salt, which is really common, would not be allowed in organic. Homeopathy and herbs are allowed. FDA-approved vitamins and minerals are allowed. And like we talked about before, the parasiticides are allowed for dairy only with that 90-day milk withhold. And it is worth noting ivermectin, which is currently one of those parasiticides that's allowed, it is up to be removed from the national list, so that's going to no longer be allowed soon. We're waiting for that final rule to come out still, but there'll still be other options if you absolutely need to. I should mention with that, with the dewormers, we do look for natural and other materials to be used first, preventative, and then once you've demonstrated that that is not successful, then you can move to the synthetic materials to treat your animals. Any questions with the livestock? Okay, meat requirements. So we talked about this a little bit. If you are looking to do organic meat, you have to manage them organically from the last third of gestation or the last third of their pregnancy for the offspring to be considered certified organic. So if you are a beef operation and you're looking to become certified, your pre-existing beef herd, none of those animals would be considered organic. It would just be the offspring that they produce once you've applied and have that organic management plan in place. 3 months after that is when those calves will start to qualify for organic. With poultry, it's second day of life. Most people will buy, get their day-olds in the mail. They receive them, and then from that moment forward, they're managing them organically to qualify. And dairy transition, is the other method of going about that. If you're just going to produce organic milk, we do the 1-year dairy transition, 100% organic management in that 1 year, and then your animals can produce organic milk, but they will never qualify for meat. So what do you do once you have your animal? It's organic, you're ready to sell some meat, so what do you do? This is where it gets a little bit trickier because there's not a lot of certified organic meat processors in the state. There's maybe a few more within the last couple of years. There's a handful now, but it's still really challenging for a lot of people to figure out how do they process that meat, how do they get those cuts that they can turn around and sell at the farmer's market or wherever. Ultimately, it has to be in a certified organic slaughter facility. Your other option, and a lot of people will go this route, is to do the direct sales. So they'll sell half, a quarter live animal, and then once that transaction is made, it's up to the buyer at that point if they want to have that custom cut up at a butcher or however they want to handle it at that point. They just can't represent anything from that animal as organic once that transaction has been made. So a lot of our beef operations do go that route where they do the live sales as organic and then use their butcher. We are having a discussion group tomorrow about this sort of topic and how do you get your local butcher to certify organic and how do you get more availability. So it's a really good topic and something that we're trying to encourage in the state to get more options out there because that's definitely a big area that we see a lot of people struggle with. If you do have that certified organic processor, that's great. You get your organic certificate, they cut up your meat, you can label it and sell it as organic. Just get your label approved before you do it, and then keep in mind that the Food Safety Inspection Service, or FSIS, also needs to approve most meat labels. When it comes to other agencies, we really strictly just look at organic requirements, but there are other things to keep in mind, such as New York State Ag and Markets, FSIS, FDA, different organizations that have requirements that may also apply to you. We may remind you of that, but ultimately, we really just focus on the organic side of things. Any other questions about that? Meat? Too many meat people here? We currently offer 100% grass-fed certification. This is a relatively new program that's been going on for the last couple of years. Right now, it's only open to currently certified organic operations. So if you're already certified with us as organic, you could add on the grass-fed. Basically how that works is we can do it all in the same inspection as your organic, so it's pretty easy. There is an application that you would complete. Meat animals are required to be grass-fed for their entire life in order to qualify for that 100% grass-fed, which no grain from birth. And then dairy animals can go through a 90-day transition. So we can work with you on that. There's quite a lot of operations this last year who were going to grass-fed milk markets that were coming aboard, and we were helping them with their 1-year dairy transition to organic and that 90-day transition to grass-fed. One of the advantages of that is you could use the grass-fed claim and the grass-fed logo on your meat without, having that certified or being able to use that certified organic claim, because if you don't have a processor nearby, you can still use that grass-fed claim. Okay, we're just going to touch a little bit on labeling and value added. Labels must be approved prior to use. If you have farm labels that you want to use or anything like that, there are specific regulations or requirements that you're going to have to follow, and we will approve those before you use them and go start selling at the farmer's market. Definitely make sure you get those approved first. We'll look at the composition of what's going into your products. We'll look at the use of the certification statement and the seal. Basically, that's one of the main requirements is if you're going to label your product as organic, it has to have that certification statement where it says certified organic by, followed by your certifier. So NOFA-NY York, LLC in this case is what we would look for on that label, and that goes under your distributor info. That's pretty much one of those big basic things. I know whenever I go to the store nowadays, I see an organic product, I'll pick it up, I'll turn it over, I'll be like, who's certifying this product? And there might not even be a certification statement on there. And that, there is a lot of faulty stuff happening out there. And so it is something that really helps you to know and for your buyers to know where that verification came from for that certified organic claim. USDA seal, of course. Yes, question?
Does that count for value-added products?
Yeah, well, if you're going to label it and sell it retail, then yes, you would absolutely have to follow those requirements. Is that what you're asking?
Sort of like, let's say, for example, you're making jam and you have like sugar and you've used organic sugar as one of your ingredients. Who's certifying you to say that your jam is organic?
Right, well, we would be certifying, like say you certified with NOFA, we would be certifying you and we would look at each of those ingredients. We have forms that you would complete that list out every ingredient that you're using. Typically, we ask for an organic certificate for any purchased ingredients. So if you're using the sugar, we would ask for you to obtain that organic certificate. If you just went to the grocery store and bought like a 5-pound bag of organic sugar, as long as that packaging had the certification statement on it that we could then contact that certifier to verify, then that would be sufficient. We do understand for a lot of the smaller scale people, it's hard to get that organic certificate. So we do accept those as verification. But yeah, we look at every single ingredient, whether it's organic or non-organic, because there are some non-organic ingredients that are allowed, salt obviously, and other things. And we look at each and every one of those to make sure they're meeting the regulations. Yeah, you're welcome. So like we were saying, the product profile, we fill that out, we look at everything. And then the other thing that we look at as part of the value added and on-farm processing is your cleaning and sanitizing process, what pest controls are you using, if you're a split operation, how are you preventing commingling and contamination, different things like that. Really with that split operation, we didn't talk about it a lot earlier, but that's something to keep in mind through all aspects of your production and your farm is if you're doing organic and non-organic at the same time, which you absolutely can do, we just look for there to be more documentation, more verifiable practices that show that separation. We may be asking you to keep a non-certified harvest record if you're doing organic and non-organic hay, for example. We'll look at those yields to make sure in your sales records that that everything's jiving as far as that goes. So that is something to keep in mind with split operations. Any other questions on labeling? Yeah.
Cleaning operations, how does that work with soaps?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're not, I mean, most are not organic, but.
Right. So yeah, generally speaking, most conventional cleaning products are allowed as long as the official wording is an intervening event that removes the residue. So basically that means a rinse, like you're doing a really good rinse, or there's something in place to remove any residue that might be left from that soap. So obviously most soaps you're rinsing anyways. Milk house products do get a little different because of the pipelines and the enclosed nature. So there are some different things we look at with that, but for the most part, you know, most cleaning and sanitizing materials, the only ones that we really don't allow are quaternary ammonias. Those are very restricted. And then conversely, bleach is one of the most common that can be used per FDA or labeled dilution rates and does not require events. So that's a really common material that we see for sanitation. Yeah. Is there a question?
Yeah, what's the operation split between transitional and part of it you're going to certify?
Yep, that's fine as well. So we internally, we track that transitional side of things. We, you know, if it's fields that you're talking about, we'll keep all those fields on your field list that show your eligibility dates. We're going to be looking at your applied amendment and spray records for that, and your harvest and yields and all of that, just like we do for your organic fields. So yeah, I mean, it's very common. We get a lot of that with the transitional and also just split operations in general. We get a lot of people who want an aspect of their farm to be certified and then an aspect that's not. And when it's completely separate, like they're certifying their field crops, but they have a home garden, you know, there's really not much concern there. But, you know, it is just something to keep in mind of that separation. Okay, we're going to start back up. Thank you guys for coming back for the fascinating topic of record keeping. Like I said before, this probably won't go too long, but we do think it's important to talk about it because this is a really big part of the organic system plan and something that is a stumbling block for a lot of farmers. I don't think it's a thing that most of them enjoy doing, want to do, but it is an important thing. And once you sort of get the process rolling and figure out, you know, what it is you need to do and how to do it and make that part of your daily or weekly routine, it becomes a lot easier. We help a lot with that in that we provide blank forms that you can use for just about every aspect of that, of your required record keeping. So that does help, so we can give it to you. You are always welcome to use your own record keeping system as long as all of the required information is there. And we're going to go over some of that in the next few slides about exactly what kind of information are we talking about, what does it look like, how do you go about keeping that, just to kind of get you started with like the basics of a basic record keeping system for a farm. So basically when we talk about record keeping, we're talking about an audit trail. And what we mean by that is the trail of documents that tracks your organic product from start to finish, or conversely from sale back to its point of origin. And that is what we are required to do as an organic certifier. Our inspectors will come out on site and they will be doing this audit trail review and doing a traceability check along with an in-out balance to make sure that your record keeping is sufficient and meets all of the requirements that we can track that product fully. So it's definitely important to keep those records up to date and available at inspection. This is a really common thing we run into where the records weren't available at inspection. That just complicates it because now you have to send everything into the office and then we have to sit and review it there. So it's really nice when you have those records available for the inspector. You are required to keep your record keeping system for a minimum of 5 years. That's from when you start certification. A lot of people will apply and they'll be like, well, I don't have records from 5 years ago. You know, we're not asking for that other than whatever we may need to verify, maybe seeds or something like that. But, you know, it's starting once you are certified, you know, minimum of 5 years. And sort of like I was mentioning with the audit trail, this sort of at the bottom, it kind of lays it out for you a little bit more clearly on like each step along the way and that you would have to keep records for. So for a crop, you got your seed records, field, harvest, storage, and market. And then for livestock, you start at the dam or the mother, or if it's day-old poultry, you know, that invoice for those day-olds. through their feed, their processing, and if you're doing any storage with that meat, and then the market. So that's sort of something to think about when you are establishing your record keeping, is what records do I need to make sure that this tracks through every step of the process. Okay, so types of records. We're going to just talk about the types of records that you'll want to keep, along with some examples of our internal forms that you can use. Farm and facility diagrams, we talked about maps already, but other things that we look for, barnyard layouts. If you're a livestock operation, we want to see those feed storage areas. If you have silos or grain bins, the outdoor access area, you know, where the cows are being kept. If you have pigs and poultry, where their housing is located. The packing shed is a nice one. We get a facility diagram if you're doing post-harvest handling that's larger in scale. That's definitely critical. If you've got packing lines and different things, we would definitely want to be seeing that visually on a diagram. If it's really, really basic, you just use a table and put some things in a package, we're probably not going to ask for a diagram of that. So. Depending on the complexity as well, we could get into flow charts, but that's more with the processing end of things. Input records, the applied amendment spray record is probably like the biggest and most important one. When there's a picture of it right there, that is where you would keep track of any and all inputs to your fields, not seeds necessarily. That's kind of a different thing. The inspectors really do most of the verifying for the seeds, looking at your invoices and your receipts. This is more for fertilizers, pest controls, manure, anything like that that you're applying to the fields. The type of information we would look for, just to give you an idea, is the date that you're doing it, the field ID, what it is that's being applied, the rate, you know, how much of it are you putting down, and who's doing it. So that's a pretty, you know, solid example of the type of record you would need to keep for your field inputs. Receipts, I mentioned, definitely keep your receipts. The inspectors definitely look at these. If you're buying a bag of potting mix, you know, keep the receipt. If you're buying seeds, look for that seed documentation. So definitely hold on to all of that stuff. If it's not there at inspection, they're going to put it on your exit interview for submission, and then we're going to be hounding you for it. So, you know, the best you can keep those records together, the easier it is to kind of get through the process. Seed and transplant records, I kind of mentioned that already. We're looking at purchase records, seed tags. We're not saying you necessarily have to keep every single seed pack. We definitely want to see the receipts. The seed tags are really nice for field crops because they give us information about if it's treated or any inoculants or anything that might have already on it, so those are really useful. Seed search documentation. We talked about this on the seed slide as far as that commercial availability search of checking your 3 sources before using non-organic. So you're going to want to write that down in some fashion. Typically, it doesn't have to be complicated. You could write down, these are the catalogs I checked, you know, here's the companies I called, the people I talked to, the dates that you did it on, what the result was, and then that's something that the inspectors will look at to make sure you're actually looking to make sure something's not commercially available as organic before you're using the non-organic. So that's a good one. We do have a form that you can use if you're so inclined, but that's typically done a little more casually, you know, per the farmer, how they prefer to do it. Untreated non-GMO documentation, that's a big one which we talked about. When you're getting those non-organic seeds, make sure it's verified as untreated and non-GMO. Transplant production records, and then organic certificates. If you're purchasing transplants, certified organic transplants, you definitely want to make sure you get that organic certificate when you make that transaction. It tends to be a lot easier to ask for that up front when you're getting ready to make that purchase rather than after the fact. And we have seen this come up for people quite often. Well, they'll go buy their organic tomatoes and then we'll ask them for the organic certificate, or the inspector will, and then they don't have it, and then they have to go and get it, and oops, he doesn't have an organic certificate. So a lot of people don't necessarily understand what's involved in the regulations when you are certified organic. So, you know, don't leave yourself open like that. Make sure you're asking for that organic certificate up front so you can make sure you're actually getting a certified product. Field records, The field histories and affirmations, that's like when you're adding a new field for the first time. We look for that new field history form that you're going to complete and that new field affirmation from the previous owner-manager if you haven't had control of that. Soil and water tests. The water tests are required if you're using non-municipal water to wash your vegetables, human crops, eggs, things like that. If for irrigation water, we don't require a water test for that. We're really just talking about that final handling step where you're using well water, for instance. And sometimes with cleaning and sanitation, we may look for water tests depending on the level of processing that you're doing and using water. Soil tests are, again, not always mandatory. We do recommend them, especially for a first-time certified operation, so that you can get a baseline for where your soil is at to look at where you may need to go as far as increasing the fertility and, you know, meeting that side of the regulations. Soil tests are required. I should say testing is required if you're using micronutrients. So that's the only exception to that, is if you're going to apply micronutrients to your soil, such as boron, copper, zinc, things like that. There is a list of what we're talking about specifically. The rule does specify that there has to be a documented deficiency, and that deficiency needs to be documented via testing. So most often that is soil tests is what we see. It could be tissue tests. It could come via information from an educational source or an expert in the field, an agronomist perhaps, someone who's working with you that's saying, you need this boron, and here's why. Even though your soil test might not necessarily show a deficiency, we understand this is not like a cut and dry area, that, you know, the different micronutrients interact with plants in different ways, and different plants have different needs than others. So we are open to being sound and sensible about micronutrient usage, but you just need to show that need somehow. Yes?
For the water testing, what's the frequency that you have to show?
Annual.
Yep. And then for the soil test, do you have to request a different type of test, or is this like the standard testing that you would get when you send your sample into Cornell?
Right. Typically, the standard testing, I think, would suffice. It would only be if you're getting into this micronutrient territory that I was mentioning. A lot of the tests might not test for cobalt or molybdenum. You know, if you have that trace amounts of that in some input you're using, you know, you're going to want to make sure you specify that they're doing the micronutrient testing as well. Yeah.
What's required to be tested for the water test?
Potability. So we're looking at coliform, total coliform in E. coli. Yeah. Yep, just potability. I mean, it's a good idea to be aware of if there's a nitrate issue or other contaminants that might be in your water, but ultimately we're looking at, from a food safety standpoint, the potability.
Heavy metal or no?
Yeah, we don't require that. That's what I'm saying. That's an area where it's good for you to know for your overall management plan, but that's not exactly. We're just looking for that potability test. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so moving on from there, we hit harvest and sales. So on the other end, this is an equally as important area that needs to be documented accurately. For harvest records, there's an example there of our internal form that we supply if you want to use it. The things we're looking for is date, of course, the field ID, the amount of crop that's being harvested, what's being harvested, if it's being stored somewhere, and then if it's being sold, you can include that sales information on there as well. This form works really well for field crops because you're only harvesting once a year, maybe if you're doing a couple cuttings of hay. This form does not work very well for vegetable operations. So most of them laugh and they're like, yeah, you know, I can't use that, which we understand. And we have some samples that in the application packet of some different types of records you might keep for your vegetable harvest. But most of our operations develop their own records. Usually it's maybe an Excel spreadsheet or something along those lines that works for them. It can be fairly simple as long as it contains this information. So as long as you have that date, that field ID, what's harvested, and the amount. However, that needs to lay out for you that makes sense, typically that works. So we would just ask for a sample of that record so that we have that on file and we can see how it is you're tracking that information. And then, yeah, we accept, many different, we've seen many types of handwritten and computer-generated documents as far as that goes. If you are keeping your own records that don't have all that information, you might need to keep separate storage records perhaps. If you're doing non-certified crops, we talked a little bit earlier about split operations. That's another type of record keeping that you'll need to be keeping track of. Equipment cleaning and purging logs is definitely another of those big ones. There's a lot of people out there who do contract or custom work, or they are a split operation where they have organic and non-organic fields or dual use equipment, and that's fine. Basically what you need to do is perform a clean out that's thorough enough to remove any residues, do a purge if it's necessary. If there's areas of that equipment that can't be easily cleaned out, you can run a purge of organic crop through it, document that amount that's been purged and what you've done with it, and then you're free to use that equipment on your organic fields. A lot of people will do, like if they have an area of their field that serves as the buffer zone, they will, harvest that either last or separately, or they will do that and then purge some of the organic through and then harvest the organic section of the field. So there's definitely options and things to think about. I should mention that the most common pieces of equipment that we see that do require the purge, it would be combines, of course. That's something, and then small square balers, or square balers, usually require a bale or so of purged hay to kind of work any of that non-organic chaff and residue through the piece of equipment. So that's a good one to keep in mind. We could accept a standard operating procedure for clean out instead of a daily log, so that's something we could work with you on depending on what your scenario is and what makes sense. But ultimately you need to be able to verify you are doing that and that you are keeping that clean out records, showing how you're doing that on farm. Transportation records, that could be another thing that you may need to keep if you are transporting yourself, or if you're using another company, is it a clean truck when it arrives or when it departs, and making sure that that is a clean environment as well as it's transporting organic product. Sales records. So this is one where we don't really have a set form necessarily for it. Generally, the farmers keep their own versions of sales records, invoices. They use whatever, computer software works for them. But what we're looking for is sort of that same idea. You've got, your dates and the quantities and that. When we're looking at sales, we don't care about the money. We're looking at the total amount sold so that we can compare that to the amount harvested, so we can compare that to the amount planted, to the seed purchased, to do that traceability. So it's really important that your sales records and your harvest records communicate with one another. So if you have a sales record that talks, in pounds, and you have a harvest record that talks in bunches, the inspector is going to look at that and say, I can't do anything with this. Like, I can't trace this because I don't know what bunches means to pounds. So just something to think about, like making sure those units are consistent across your records so that it's easy to be able to kind of do that trace back when the inspector is there. Other things to keep in mind with sales, besides like invoicing or something like that, is CSA. If you're doing a CSA, you should be keeping distribution records or totals of the amounts that are distributed in any given week, so that that's kind of used as the sale end of that when they're doing that traceability. And farmers market, this is another one where we run into a lot of people who don't keep records at farmers market. And we're not talking, you need to write down the name of every single person who comes and buys something. I mean, obviously that's not practical at all. But you should be keeping some sort of daily total amount that you brought to the market, the amount that goes back home with you, whether it's daily or weekly in some sort of sense, so that there's a feel for the amount that you're selling, what's left over, and what's being done with it. Because again, we're just looking for all of that information to work amongst all of the records so that it all makes sense. Because if it doesn't, we're going to question it. We're going to say, why is there 200 more pounds of this when your records say this or something like that? And then we'll be looking to you to explain why that discrepancy is there and, you know, what it is. Because the purpose of all of this, as I'm sure most of you realize, is to prevent fraud in the organic industry, and there is enough of it happening out there that it's a really serious part of what we do, is ensuring the organic integrity, making sure that, you know, when people go and buy organic product, that they can trust what they're buying is organic and that they're not getting something else. So we take it really seriously. The NOP takes it really seriously. I mean, they look at us, if not more closely than we look at the farmers. So it's something like we all kind of work together to make sure that this regulation, you know, works and can be trusted. Okay, so livestock, we'll touch on some of the record keeping you might do if you're a livestock operation. We start with the breeding or birthing or hatching records. If you are, you know, birthing or breeding, you know, you'd keep those records or hatching. If you're purchasing animals, that may be your starting point there, is that purchase documentation. If you're purchasing organic cows, obviously you're going to want to get that bill of sale that has the buyer's information on it and the animal's information on it, such as their birth date and their ID, and it should also come with an organic certificate. This is, again, that area of, like, if you're going to buy an organic product, make sure you get that verification, that organic certificate in hand to make sure that you're verifying that. Animal ID records are required. So we have an animal list that we provide for you to complete if you're doing basically any type of livestock. Poultry, we don't necessarily require that you individually ID them. It's more, right, that would be a little cumbersome. It's more that you keep track of them by flocks, and that there is a way that you are tracking them, and we have a flock records sheet that we use for that. But for the animal list, you know, we're looking at information, what kind of animal is it, what's its ID, what type of animal, what's its dam, where did it come from, the source, is it farm raised, did you buy it, does it qualify for organic slaughter? And it hasn't been treated. So this is all information we will track on that animal list, which will follow you as you go. Loss and cull records, the purchase feed log, there's an example of it here. This is another big one. When you're buying feed for your farm, you need to be keeping track of all of that. This is a really convenient form to do that on. You're going to keep your invoices and your organic certificates as well, and then the inspector will use this purchase feed log often to do a mass balance or an in-out balance on the amount of feed that you've purchased versus fed. So that one is a really important one for livestock operations. The medication and healthcare record is another big one, especially for dairies who have a little bit more intensive needs when it comes to healthcare. We ask that you write down and keep track of anything you're administering to your livestock. Vaccines, you know, you don't necessarily have to put daily feed on here, like mineral supplements and things like that, but anything from a healthcare and medication standpoint. And we will cross-check this, just as we will with your applied amendment spray record, to your products list, which we maintain internally to make sure everything you're using is on your approved list, or is it approved, and if it's not, we're then going to follow up and get information and find out, you know, what is this material that you wrote down. So that's a really good one. It also, there's columns for milk withhold. If you are using substances that require withhold time, you can document right there that you have met that withhold and what you've done with that milk. So it's a really convenient way to get all of your, you know, information laid out clearly for the inspector. Feed ration and dry matter intake forms is another big one for livestock. We provide those as well. Basically, we're asking you to write down on a monthly basis what you're feeding your animals. We can do the calculations and do the hard part if you're not interested in that aspect of it, but we are asking you to write down what's being fed daily or monthly to your animals. And then we use that to determine if you're meeting that dry matter intake requirement. Pasture plan is another one. A lot of that information is in your application. Like when you're filling out your booklet, there's going to be a lot of questions about your pasture, your fencing, type of fencing, where's the water, where's the shade, things like that. And we will use that as the majority of your pasture plan. But if you have more, you know, needs or different types of records to document that, there is a whole section of the regulations just on the pasture. So that's something to be thinking about if you're livestock. Outdoor access, of course, is an area that is required year-round. So if you're dealing with ruminants, where they're supposed to be on pasture throughout the grazing season, but we're looking also at the non-grazing season, and are those animals getting outside as much as they can be? The regulations work as far as livestock go. There's a list of temporary exemptions from being outdoors. So it consists of things like inclement weather. That's probably the biggest one we see for much of the winter here in New York. It's inclement. So, that is a valid temporary exemption, but you should be documenting either in your organic system plan or on a separate calendar or somewhere what that exemption is and what that time frame looks like. We are looking for you to maximize that outdoor time when it's a nice day, that those cows get out if they're able to. You're not writing December through March inclement weather. I mean, that's not really going to fly. We do see things like that. And with poultry, too. This is more often with people doing layers. They just want to keep them in the house the whole time. And, we are looking for them to be getting outdoors if they can be. We don't have any specific temperature requirements at this point in time. There was a proposed rule that did lay out a lot of specifics, but it's not really being implemented right now. So at this point, we're just asking for you to, be thinking and be mindful of that if you're going to do livestock, is making sure you're maximizing that outdoor access. And egg collection records, that's something a lot of times our poultry operations don't think of and we ask about, and you should be keeping track of that end product. Obviously, if you're a dairy, what goes into the bulk tank and the milk company picks up that, they're keeping track of that end of it. But with eggs or meat, you should be keeping some sort of production record. And then value added and processing. Obviously, there's record keeping involved with that as well. Other than the stuff we've already touched on, the product profiles, the ingredient verification, that's all information that you're going to need to keep. You want to keep receipts for all of those ingredients you might purchase, those organic certificates. A production log is really the main piece when you're doing simple value-added on-farm processing. It's some sort of record that shows how much you're producing and when, and are you assigning it a lot number, or how are you tracking that final product once it is produced and labeled and out for sale? How are you tracking that back to when you made it, which in turn will track back to all the other information that relates to it. So lot numbers and sales invoices. So that was it for the record keeping slides. I don't know if anyone had any specific questions about records or record keeping. Yes?
Are you required to record the temperature of your walk-in cooler?
We don't require that, no. I mean, if you're getting into food safety and different regulations may require that, I'm not entirely sure, but no, we don't require that specific, no. Yes?
Other than the paper system that you guys have developed, do you know of any other comprehensive systems that do a good job of letting you just capture the basics and then it spits it into all the things you need for organic certification?
I think there are some electronic systems out there. Do you know the name of?
So Organic is one that you
So Organic?
Yeah,
SOW,
SOW.
So Organic.
They have one that you could keep, they have forms and you could keep your records there.
Yeah, there definitely are some out there. So it's something worth, Googling or looking into, is there probably is some good resources as far as that goes. Yeah.
Sometimes there's some here at the trade show, businesses that do that.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, yeah. Yes?
For a farm in transition, for the 3 years leading up to your certification, are you looking for like a 100% complete record set?
No. We understand that we really start that clock when you apply for actual certification. If we're doing this transition with you, you're with us for that 3-year transition, we will be looking for you to start establishing that record-keeping system as part of that requirements. But, ultimately, if you apply, your land is ready, you apply with us, we're not going to be looking for all of those sort of records going back 3 years. Just the history on your fields is really the biggest part. Yeah, it's a good question. So just a couple more slides, and this one is kind of just about inspections. We already talked about, you know, how you would get an annual inspection. That occurs typically during the growing season, early on for new applicants, and then anytime during the growing season once you're already certified. That inspector could be there in May, the inspector could be there in September. You're just not really sure. They do contact you ahead of time to work it out, to geographically, you know, with other operations in their area, you know, to make it more cost effective. Yes?
Sorry, at what point can you claim that you're certified once you've applied for?
Right. Yep, so you can claim you're certified when you have received your organic certificate. So that's sort of at the completion of the process. So you apply, you get inspected, you'll get, and then afterwards, you know, we'll do that final determination and issue your certificate or a letter about more information that might be needed. When you receive that certificate, that's when you're certified. Yeah. That's a really, really good question and something to keep in mind. So a lot of people think their inspector is their certifier, and that the inspector says, okay, looks good, and then they think they're certified, and then they get a letter from the office 3 weeks later that's got like 10 items to respond to, and you know, I mean, so you know, it is something to keep in mind. The inspectors are there to serve a purpose. They're there to observe and report, but that they don't have the final say or make any decisions on the certification. Yeah. So, right, you have your annual inspection. Other things to keep in mind is that we do unannounced inspections. So we're required to do 5% of our operations annually, unannounced inspections. So we're just gonna show up. You know, we might have a plan. You might be risk-based. You might be a split operation, or there might be spray drift issues, or outdoor access, or you know, who knows what it might be. Or you could just be random, pick out of the hat. So, you know, we definitely do that, 5+% a year, where we're just gonna show up on the farm and look at some aspect of your production. And then residue testing is another one. We are also required, in addition to that 5% of unannounced, is another 5% of residue. So that's where we're going to physically take a sample of something from your farm, send it to our lab, who runs the gamut of different pesticide residues to test it for any contamination. So, you know, often that's like a finished product, but it could also be soil, water, something like that. Question?
I just want to ask you, if I have a farm and across the street we have a different farm, is it possible that some of that fertilizer and stuff that they normally use might go onto my farm? So that's what the residue is all about, right?
Yes, more or less, exactly. He was saying, you know, if you have an organic field and you have a spray drift issue, is that what we're doing this for? More or less, yeah. I mean, the spray drift is definitely a big concern, but also just checking to make sure people aren't cheating the system or saying they're doing something and they're not, or buying in something that's contaminated that they then use, you know, on their land or in their livestock, which could create contamination. Feed, for instance, you know, we do sample feed. You might buy in a load of organic grain and you think it's all good to go, but who knows what happened down the line from there that may have contaminated that. So it's sort of looking at all different aspects of that production system to make sure, you know, that we're looking, that there's some accountability, that it's not all, I mean, it more or less is an integrity-based system, but there are measures in place to give it, you know, more verification and more, you know, trust in that it is what it says it is. We also do market monitoring. We show up at the farmers markets and look around and see what our producers are doing, how they're advertising, if they've got something under their organic banner that's not organic, or, you know, that sort of thing. And complaints is another big part of what we do. Yes, question?
When you're at market, should you have a copy of your certificate with you at all times?
Should you? I mean, you know, personally, I don't think it's a bad idea. I mean, it's nothing we require, but, you know, I mean, I think there is more educated consumers out there who might ask, and we have a lot of our operations who like to display that as part of their display. We do offer a laminated certificate, and a lot of people, you know, incorporate that in their banners and whatnot. So I think, I mean, if you're at a farmer's market, you might want to check with the manager, but I believe most of them would require an organic certificate if you're representing as organic. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any oversight over any kind of minimum standards for rinse and pack sheds, hand washing stations, toilets? Are you considering like if these things are, if any kind of minimum standard is met for those kind of things.
Right, so we don't really go there with organic. Food safety, we figure, is doing a pretty good job, and GAPS at looking at those sort of things. We strictly follow the organic regulations, and there's nothing specific in there about that sort of thing. But what we do look at is that overall, that your plan is adequate enough to prevent any sort of contamination. So if the inspector is there and he sees a situation that looks a little questionable, they're going to report that back to us, and we in turn will report that to the correct authority. Like, we being only organic certifiers, we don't branch into food safety too much. I mean, until that, you know, there's more specifics out there about how those two things intertwine. Yeah. So the complaints, we do get a fair amount of complaints, and we take them very seriously. Every single one we get, we will investigate. We will address with, if it's one of our certified operations, we might go out and do an unannounced inspection, get records, or do whatever we need to do to investigate and resolve that issue. So that's another area that, you know, that takes up a big chunk of our time. And some of those complaints have been very valid and have resulted in non-compliance, proposed suspensions, or even revocations of organic certificates. So it's a really good system that, you know, any person can feel like they have a say, or if they see something happening that shouldn't be, that they should be able to report that and have there be consequences. So, you know, we absolutely follow up on all the complaints we receive. If there's a complaint with an operation that we don't personally certify, there's not a whole lot we can do, but the NOP also takes their complaints very seriously, and they're doing a much better job now about turning around the investigations and addressing those complaints in a more timely fashion. So yeah, that's definitely another big area. So that's about it for that section. I know it's a little early yet, but we're going to be hanging out here. If any of you have questions about your specific situation or anything about what we've talked about today, please come see us. We're also set up, the LLC table is just across from the bookstore. We got all kinds of information, fact sheets, brochures with the money information if you're interested in costs. And we're just going to be hanging out there all weekend. So any of you who are interested, please come see us. If you want an application packet, we can email it. Yeah, whatever works. So, yes, question?
For the fees, if you get certified in more than one area, how does that work?
Right, so our fee structure is based on gross organic sales. So for the first year, you're projecting it out for that year. So no matter how many different areas you're looking to certify, you would look at that total number that you're anticipating to find your fee category on the chart. And then the following year, you would use your actual income from the previous year to determine that category. So most often people start off sort of in the bottom because they're not really sure how their organic sales are going to go. So we have that, and then once you have paid that amount in full back to us, and I should mention that that fee also includes the cost of the inspection. Often with you look at costs from other certifiers, they handle their inspection costs completely separately and bill them directly to you, whereas our fee includes the inspection and all of the administrative work that goes with it. So that was that one's fee, and then once you've paid that, you are eligible for that 75% back per scope. So if you're saying you're doing crop and livestock, you might be able to get more than 750.
Okay, so how, like, okay, so just look at the structure. Right?
Yeah.
It's based on the whole sales, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes?
Is there a minimum and maximum on the fees?
Yeah, the minimum. So the bottom category is less than $15,000. So that's sort of like that baseline a lot of our new applicants come in at because they're not really sure where they're going to be. And then there is a cap. I don't know what it is. It's like over 500,000 or something.
Well, the most you pay in fees is $8,000 a year. And that's
8,000.
big, and we have
Big,
very
big.
few that are there.
Yeah.
But the lowest, the lowest fee is like $625 if you pay, plus then if that's crop, and you get 75% of that back with cost share.
Okay.
And then the highest fee you pay is $8,000, and that's talking if you're crop and livestock. Handling is another component, but if you're crop and livestock, that's the beginning and that's the end.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep.
And again, that includes your annual inspection cost in that.
Okay.
So thank you all for coming. I appreciate you hanging in with us. And like I said, if you have any questions, we'll be around. I hope you all enjoy the conference. It'll be fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.